Okay, and now it's time for our weekend recap. We're going to start it off with the fight between Romero and Anthony Yigit. This was supposed to be a lightweight contest, but it was fought well above lightweight. I'm not a big believer in Romero's boxing. I'm just going to come out and say that. I tried to cut the kid some slack. I did pick him to win, and I did pick him to win by way of knockout before the half. As it turns out, it happened just after the half.
7th round TKO stoppage.
No surprises there. Anthony Yigit is a lot better than what we saw yesterday. But yesterday's Anthony Yigit was an Anthony Yigit that had not had a fight in roughly 2 years, had not fought since June of 2019. In that way, this was a very advantageous situation for Romero, who, if I say so myself, did not look impressive at all. Anthony still appeared to be the better boxer, but Anthony's got drawbacks. One among them is that the guy can't punch.
Can't crack an egg.
Was effectively connecting with several shots to the very flawed Romero, touching him, and perhaps if there were more on the punches, things might have worked out differently. But Anthony, even when he was a more active boxer than what we saw last night, he was never that big a puncher.
He can land shots.
He can get off, but if there's nothing on those shots, he's not going to be able to keep the other guy off. And that's what we saw in this very messy affair between these two guys. Romero oftentimes looking quite awkward. There's just no other way to describe it. The cringe factor. Watching Romero swing for the fences with those frat boy hooks, hyperextending, lunging in, the kind of shots that a more experienced boxer with some punch could capitalize on. Make no mistake, this was a very advantageous situation for Rolly, and even in that situation, at least from where I was sitting, he didn't look impressive.
Looked awful.
Missing punches, very big punches, big shots, oftentimes losing his form, resembling something like a grade schooler in the middle of a Donnybrook, in the middle of a scrap.
Literally pushed Anthony Yigit down.
Well, I think at one point he threw him. A lot of roughhouse tactics, a lot of horseplay, kind of stuff you'd expect from a couple of kids. Rolly was deducted a point as a result of these antics, as a result of these shenanigans.
Punches the guy, then pushes him with his elbow.
I mean, fighting dirty. Even dirty boxing does have a level of expertise, a level of craftsmanship, and that's not what we saw from Rolly. We just saw a very flawed fighter have his way with a very inactive fighter.
Rolly's food for the gods at 135.
The kid sucks, man. He sucks. He fucking sucks. He'd never be able to get away with any of that crap if it were a Richard Comey opposite the ring of him. Somebody like that.
You and I both know he's not going to fight somebody like that.
He is a permanent resident of Al Hyman's Isolation Island, so he's only going to fight in-house fighters. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if in his very next fight he locks horns with Gervonta Davis, as Romero is the WBA's interim champion in the lightweight division. WBA could always order a fight between Rolly and Gervonta upon Gervonta's descent back to the lightweight division, since Leonard Ellerbe said he's not going to stay at 140 pounds.
Yeah, he could be the next Can Gervonta kicks down the road.
I'm just giving it to you straight. It's the only way I know how to give it to you. And Romero sucks.
He won the fight.
But I knew he'd win the fight. I picked him to win the fight by way of knockout. He still sucks. I mean, he really, really, really sucks.
That's all I have to say about that.
And we come to the main event of that same card, the card that I'm sure most of you have in mind on this Sunday afternoon. The fight between CHARLO, Unified Junior Middleweight Champion CHARLO versus WBO Junior Middleweight Champion Brian Castaño, who many of you feel was robbed of the victory, who many of you feel deserved to get the decision. These are just my thoughts. I don't agree with that 117-111 scorecard. Let's just get that right out of the way. There's no way you can reconcile having it that wide for CHARLO. I don't know what that Vasquez guy was thinking, but it is Texas.
There's always funny scorecards coming out of Texas.
If I had a nickel for every funny-looking scorecard that came out of the state of Texas, I'd be a very rich man. The rematch earlier this year between Chocolatito and Juan Francisco Estrada, that was in the state of Texas. A lot of people felt that Chocolatito did enough to win the fight. Who'd they give the fight to? They gave it to Juan Estrada.
So wake up and smell the coffee already.
I'm no Monday morning quarterback. I told you guys ahead of this fight there's room for controversy. There's room for controversy because of the contrast in styles. It's going to boil down to what the judges like. Do they like the volume and pressure and scrappy combinations of Brian Castaño, or will they like the movement, clean boxing, and clean punching of CHARLO? Jermel, who doesn't have the work rate of Brian Castaño, but will land the more photo finish punches. That's what we saw.
I told you guys all of this ahead of the fight.
It's going to be tight. And because it's going to be tight, there will be room for controversy. You can score it however the fuck you want to score it from the comfort of your own home. You can do that, but how the judges have it is what's going to decide what happens here. And that's what I had in mind ahead of this fight, and that's what I had in mind during this fight. First round kicks off. It's a very quiet round. Brian Castaño is attempting to close the gap as I expected him to.
Jamel's back is to the ropes.
And one of the defining characteristics of not only the first round, but the first half is that a lot of times, Romero Charlo was moving around that ring, as I expected him to, back against the ropes, and I noticed that Brian Castaño was not able to dive right in.
Not straight away.
He'd get checked at the door by Romero Charlo's lead hand, his jab hand, which he'd use to touch Brian Castaño on the arms, touch him on the gloves, just before Brian could get in there and let some combinations go, throw some flurries, throw some shots. And this was the defining characteristic, the aesthetic of the first round. It was a quiet first round where neither guy landed anything meaningful, and you're not quite sure who's having it their way, because Jermel's back is against those ropes, but Brian isn't quite capitalizing off of that.
Besides cornering him, what else was he doing?
In the first round, and that made the first round a swing round for me. You could have swung it to Brian, you could have swung it to Romero, because neither guy landed anything meaningful, and neither guy was having it all their way. And the second round, it really was more of the same. More distance control from Charlo's jab, and more pressure from Brian Castaño, who was attempting to gain safe entry to let his hands go. And in the second half of the round, he managed to do that, but Romero Charlo, he let off a salvo of his own, fought his way off those ropes. Very eye-catching stuff. And for me, that was enough for him to nick the second round.
He controlled the distance for most of the round.
And he did manage to fight Brian Castaño off. He did manage to get Brian's respect when Brian got a little bit too froggy. In the third round, you saw more of the same. More distance control as a result of the jab. I mean, I saw a lot of people on Twitter scoring these rounds for Brian Castaño, and I wasn't sure why, because he's managing to get Charlo's back on those ropes consistently, but he's really not capitalizing on it once he gets there. The most that he did that entire round was in the last 17 seconds of it, when he landed some very clean, clear shots that looked to have hurt Charlo, but that was in the last 17 seconds of the round. What was he doing the other 2 minutes?
Go back and watch it.
The other 2 minutes and 30 seconds of the round. What, Brian was having it all his way in the third? No, I don't think so. That looked like a Charlo round to me that Brian tried to steal with a late salvo.
Too little, too late.
Oh, I noticed how many people were giving me snarky comments on boxing Twitter for how I had the fight scored, and I warned those people, when this fight is over, don't be surprised if the judges' scorecards don't look nothing like yours.
At least one of these judges is going to have Jamel up on the cards.
If you came into this fight mindful of that, if you came into this fight with that understanding that this is a fight that's being fought in the state of Texas, where Romero Charlo's from,
maybe you'll have a better idea of how the judges have it.
How they might have it, as I saw several individuals on boxing Twitter having Brian Castaño ahead on the cards, and I just didn't see it that way. In rounds 4 and 5, it really was more of the same, and I think what's getting lost in translation here is that because these two guys have contrasting styles,
they're different.
Brian Castaño, the volume puncher, the pressure fighter, versus Romero Charlo, the boxer puncher who doubles as a sharpshooter. You got Brian backing Romero Charlo off, but even though he's backing him off, he's not really having his way with him because he's getting checked at the door by the lead hand. This was evident in the fourth round. This was evident in the fifth round. So what do you like? Do you like the pressure from Brian or the clean boxing from Romero?
Neither guy's manhandling the other.
Are you even taking into account that when Brian does let his hands go, not all those shots are getting through? Some of them are being blocked. From where I was sitting, that point, with the first round being a swing round, it could have been 5 rounds to 1 in favor of Romero Charlo, who isn't having his way with Brian, but Brian's not having his way with him, and because the fight's in the state of Texas, the judges might have Romero up at the end of the 6th. If you guys decided to give Brian the third round based on what he did in the last 17 seconds, hey, you're setting yourself up to be disappointed. I'll be honest with you guys that the first clear Castaño round that I saw had to have been the 7th round. He was applying pressure the way he was throughout, but he was actually landing punches. And Romero Charlo was visibly gassed, visibly tired, circling away while Brian not only moved him around the ring, but actually landed shots. Clear shots that you don't have to look for. You couldn't have mistaken the 7th round as being anything other than a Castaño round. Any one of those other rounds? Up for grabs.
Who fucking knows?
Clearly not the people on Boxing Twitter. By this time, they think Brian Castaño's got a sizable lead on Jermell Charlo.
I warned you.
The 8th round was another clear Castaño round for me. At this point, I'm thinking to myself that perhaps the judges have this 5 rounds to 3 in favor of Jermell Charlo, with Brian Castaño having clearly picked up the 7th and 8th rounds due to his pressure and his volume punching that's actually landing. At this point from where I was sitting, the first round was a swing round that you could have swung to either guy. So if you swing it to Brian and you tack on round 7 and 8...
Right?
Judges might have this thing 5 rounds to 3 in favor of Jermell. Round 9 was another Brian Castaño round for me. A very visibly tired Jermell Charlo was on the receiving end of a lot of shots. The body work from Brian Castaño in that round stood out to me. So at this point from where I'm sitting, I'm thinking the judges might have this 5 rounds to 4 with Brian Castaño closing the gap.
Catching up.
10th round rolls around, and this was a clear Jermell Charlo round. You couldn't have mistaken this round for being anything other than a Charlo round, because in this round, Jermell Charlo quite visibly hurt Brian Castaño, and it's a wonder that Brian made it out of that round on his feet, because he spent a good chunk of it evading Jermell Charlo's advances. Jermell, who frazzled him, and if I'm being honest, let him off the hook. This was Jermell's opportunity to close the show. Take it out of the judges' hands so we're not arguing about how they scored it on Sunday morning. At this point, I'm thinking to myself, the judges have got to have Jermell Charlo up by, I don't know, maybe a round. One of the glaring issues in association with how this fight was scored isn't just Nelson Vasquez's scorecard, which is pretty fucking wide for Jermell Charlo. There's also Steve Weisfeld's scores for the 10th round to consider. He scored the 10th round a 10-8 round in favor of Jermell Charlo, even though Brian Castaño wasn't knocked down in that round. I mean, it was definitely a Charlo round. He definitely did enough to win it. Brian was lucky to have survived it, but scoring it a 10-8 round.
The other 2 judges didn't do that.
Steve Weisfeld did, though Steve Weisfeld, unlike the other 2 judges, once the fight was over, he had it in favor of Brian Castaño by a point.
That's why not as many people are giving him shit about his scorecard.
Tim Cheatham had it a draw, whereas Nelson Vasquez, he gave Jermell Charlo 9 rounds in the fight, 9 rounds. And you know, at minimum, what this communicates to me is what I told you in my prediction video. It all depends on what the judges like, and the judges...
The 3 of them.
I mean, look at the scorecards. Steve Weisfeld and Ted Cheatham, they gave the first round to Brian Castaño, whereas Nelson Vasquez, he gave it to Charlo.
Told you it was a swing round.
Tim Cheatham and Steve Weisfeld in the 4th round, they scored that for Brian, whereas Nelson, he scored it for Charlo. You guys at home, you must have been scoring this fight on the premise that it was happening anywhere other than the state of Texas, which is why you're setting yourselves up to get upset. What I'm doing is attempting to forecast the judges' scorecards.
Factoring in controversy.
Factoring in partial scoring that might be based on close rounds that some or at least one of the judges might so decide to give to Jermell, whereas the audience...
They might be scoring it for Brian.
Because we've seen enough funny-looking scorecards come out of the state of Texas that when a fight is happening in the state of Texas, you need to factor that into the equation. The 8th round. Tim Cheatham, Steve Weisfeld, they give it to Brian. Nelson Vasquez, he gives it to Charlo. Why? Go ask him!
Because I told you there was going to be room for controversy.
If you want my honest opinion, Brian Castaño was lucky to come away from all of this with his unbeaten record, his world title, and a draw, because funny-looking scorecards, they happen all the time in the state of Texas.
You guys haven't started factoring that into the equation yet?
There's a lot of people after the fight that was screaming robbery. There's a lot of people that woke up this morning having that robbery in mind, and I think it's because those people score fights rather altruistically, as if these things don't matter in the sport of boxing. Where a fight takes place, what state's it in, and whether or not the fight itself features a hometown fighter. Because if the round, at least in the eyes of the judges, is close enough that they can swing it to the hometown fighter, guess what they're going to do?
What do you think they're going to do? They're going to swing it to the hometown fighter.
Hell, they might decide to swing it to the hometown fighter if it's not a close round. Essentially, what I'm getting at is, I was banking on controversial scorecards, and I'm no Monday morning quarterback. I told you guys this in my prediction video. I told you guys this while I was scoring the fight live on Twitter. Don't be surprised if the judges ain't got it the way you guys at home have got it. You know, not that long ago, there was a fight between Marlon Esparza and the then reigning WBC champion, Ebeth Zamora Silva. And then, like now, I factored controversy into the equation. I factored political scorecards as part of the prediction in the prediction video. The same applies here. I told you guys to expect controversial scoring. I said it in my prediction video, and I said it again when I scored the fight live. Don't be surprised if the judges ain't got it the way you guys have got it. Controversy and partial scoring is palpable enough these days that you have to factor it into the equation. It's got to be part of the prediction. You can bank on it. Sulem Urbina did. She told me outright hours before the fight that she thinks it's going to be scored a draw. And she was right. You're going to approach every fight like a wide-eyed optimist, scoring fights on the premise of altruism and fair play. Well, I hate to break the news to you, but that's not how they score fights in Texas.
So maybe you think Castaño won.
Maybe you think he did enough to become this division's undisputed champion. I won't argue with you. What I'll ask you, however, is whether or not you factored in partial scoring as part of your prediction ahead of this fight.
This your first rodeo or something?
It ain't mine. This has happened enough times that you have to factor it into the equation. And once you do, once the judges' scorecards come back looking funny, you're not surprised.
Oh, the judges themselves are a factor in the prediction.
It was a good fight. Yeah, I could sit here telling you that I think Brian might have done enough, though ultimately I'm just glad that he came away with a draw and not a loss.
Unlike Chocolatito earlier this year.
Been through this dog and pony show one too many times. Enough times that I'm anticipating funny-looking scorecards and controversy.
What, you're not?
Saving grace here is that Brian Castaño is still the WBO's reigning junior middleweight champion. His O is still intact. It was an entertaining fight. Both guys gave a good account of themselves. And even if you feel that Brian Castaño did enough to win the fight and he was deprived of the victory, at least
He got to keep his own. He got to keep his belt.
there's guys out there that haven't gotten that much satisfaction from the judges.